Amsterdamse Poëzieweek op Kleurnet. Ja, deze week heel veel dichters. En vandaag bijvoorbeeld Eddie Woods, de man van het magazine Ins en Outs. En hij praat met Hans Plomp over de tijden dat Ben Posset van Sojo in Amsterdam One World Poetry organiseerde. We hebben deze week veel materiaal, historisch materiaal van One World Poetry. Dat hebben we gekregen van Rut Hoeks, die de Sojo-archieven beheert. Maar dus nu Amsterdamse Poëzieweek, de hele week dichters. En om te beginnen dus Hans Plomp en Eddie Woods.
Hallo iedereen, geestverwante, aardgenoten, poëzieliefhebbers. We are here to talk about One World Poetry. And we are Eddie Woods, my great old friend through the years. And I'm Hans Plomp. I think the one we are going to talk about and the events he organized is already somewhere in the netherworld, I hope. He was called Ben Posset in his last incarnation, and he kicked a lot of dust, and he left a lot of traces. I think maybe it's good to go back in history, her story, as they say nowadays.
Do they?
Yeah, and let's go back to 1977, Eddie. I think that's around the time we also met.
Well, no, I met him a year later.
You met him a year later?
I came to Amsterdam in 1978. And 1977 was that first festival which Ben was at and was organized, I believe, by Franco Beltrametti. And Harry Hoogstraten, I think, was involved in that. It was in Venice. It was called P77. But it was a forerunner to One World Poetry, which really kicked off with P78 in Amsterdam.
Yeah, right.
And that's when I met Ben, when I was first doing Ins and Outs magazine, during the first incarnation of Ins and Outs.
Yeah, because in those days Eddie started in Amsterdam an international,
features and literary magazine.
Yeah, a great magazine that for the first time put Holland on the map, on the international map, so to say, and it published people like Simon Vinkenoog and Hans Plomp together with Allen Ginsberg, Burroughs, Gary Schneider, and so on. And it established a friendship that actually never went. We are still here in the next millennium, and I think all the other contacts also went on, also through Ben Posset's, nicknamed Soyo Ben's, efforts.
Yes.
Well, back into time, I think Ben was organizing here in Amsterdam already that poetry event P78.
P78 was the first One World Poetry. Something else about Ben, maybe it's good to know. Ben was an organizer of, even long before poetry. Ben specialized in squatting. He was a major kraker here in Amsterdam and also in Japan.
Yeah, right.
And according to stories he told me, he even went so far as to squat some uninhabited islands
in Japan.
Japan, right?
Yeah,
and he had this vision of a kind of tribal gathering, right? And he had a kind of commune which didn't necessarily exist in a particular place, but it was international through contacts. And this was Soyo, which name came from his first wife, his Japanese wife, with whom he had two children. She died rather tragically. I believe it was in an automobile accident in Amsterdam. Exactly what year, I don't know. It was sometime in the 70s.
Yeah.
And but this was his vision. And when he got connected to poetry through people like Nanao Sakaki, Franco Beltrametti, Harry Hoogstraten, who had spent a lot of time abroad in Japan, who was first writing poetry himself in English, in Ireland and in America.
Yeah.
And then I believe it was, Ben says in the introduction to P78 Anthology, that he met Lewis McAdams, the American poet Lewis McAdams, in Venice at that time. And then Lewis connected him with an awful lot of people, and which made P78 possible. And if anything, it was really the first kind of international poetry gathering here of another scene that is separate from Poetry International, which we consider to be, if you will, the more established one, which fulfills its own purpose and plays its own role.
Was it already happening then, Poetry International?
I think it was then part of the Holland Festival. You can't be, absolutely certain of that, but I do believe it was happening. Perhaps not, or perhaps it started simultaneously. But Ben did something for Amsterdam, because of course Poetry International is in The Hague.
Yeah,
right?
In Rotterdam.
Is it in Rotterdam? In Rotterdam, sorry. Yes, Rotterdam. Excuse me. Something else was in The Hague, another festival, the Crossing Border Festival, which is now relocated to Amsterdam. That's how I had that confused. So,
and of course there was Jos Knipscheer, who was a publisher of, let's say, the more engaged writers in Holland, of some beat writers, so to say, among them me, for instance. And also, of course, he was publishing American writers, he was publishing American Indian writers, he was publishing black writers. In his company, in the Knipscheer, and I think Jos and Ben somehow linked up. This anthology was published by Jos Knipscheer, who is also in the netherworld. I hope they're having a good time up there, or down there, wherever it is. But how did you meet Ben, actually, first?
I met Ben when he came around to the first Ins and Outs office. That was as I say, the first incarnation of Ins and Outs. We did 3 issues. In 1978, and we were then located in an office behind a travel agency on the Nieuwe Voorburgwal. And
I remember.
We had already 2 issues out, or 2 issues out. And Ben came around, he was putting together P78, and he brought some material and talked with me about what he was planning to do, and was asking if we couldn't slot something into the magazine. And we did. I mean, this was the issue. I don't know if showing well on camera, but so we did in the center part some information about the.
And the funny thing is, I see there also a picture just before that of the Amsterdam Balloon Company.
Yes,
which is still going strong at one of the early kite festivals. Actually, I met Ben first. I don't know when it was. Must have been also, of course, it was around that time. And there was a performance of the Amsterdam Poetry Circus, which we began, I think, with Ira, with Ira Cohen, with Johnny van Doren, Steve Davidson, even Jules Deelder. At this time didn't want 1,000 guilders for performing. So, and I remember Ben popping up in the crowd, looking at us and coming afterwards to us and saying, this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of thing I would like to do, he said, although I've never been into poetry and probably never read a poem, I would like to organize this. And so this is, this was a very crucial moment. And it's funny that both you and I, you with Ins and Outs and the Poetry Circus, and I with the Balloon Company and the Poetry Circus were very much involved. And here we are in the year 2000. And I think we are going to do it again.
Actually, I wasn't involved in the Poetry Circus. That was.
Didn't you read there?
No, not in that early time. No.
Well, my memory is slightly
well, whatever. I don't.
Slippery.
I did a lot of performances subsequently. At all the usual places, the Melkweg and Paradiso and what have you, and some cafes and so on. But actually, in the Dixie Circus, I wasn't particularly on that scene. I was much too busy editing Ins and Outs magazine, and under house arrest.
Which was a fantastic thing, I think. Well, I'm often dreaming of a magazine somehow centered in Amsterdam, having the same international appeal, having the same connections as Ins and Outs magazine used to have. Because, who are the people Ben brought here in the course of the years?
Indeed, Ben brought a number of people here for the very first time, and brought them over again and again. It wasn't just the annual poetry festivals, first under the aegis of One World Poetry, and then they were all Ps, P78, P79, up through perhaps P85 or something. I know that I remember the last one I clearly recall was on the eve of 84, but then I think there was one or two after that, and they were at different places, not just at the Melkweg, but also the Brakegrond and one other place I keep forgetting the name of, a little bit farther away, but still in Amsterdam.
Not the Cosmos.
Well, the Cosmos also. The Cosmos was primarily where P78 went down, except for the closing night, which was momentous, with Herman Brood and his Wild Romance coming on at 3 a.m., the punks filling up the hall already around midnight, and it was mayhem. I wrote about it in P78 Anthology. But he brought Burroughs over for the first time. Ginsberg, who didn't come for P78 but did many times afterward. Brian Geisen, and that, of course, had a lot to do with Ira Cohen. There was so much, politicking about, and then Brian was responsible for Patti Smith coming, and then there were these...
Ferlinghetti, I remember.
Ferlinghetti was, whether P78, I'm not sure, but at certainly a subsequent one. At other events that Ben organized during the year, and he brought Burroughs over several times for smaller readings. Not a festival, but always very well attended. And was really the person responsible for organizing this type of thing, international events with international names. From many countries.
Didn't he bring Yevtushenko as well?
Yevtushenko also,
and also many the whole scene, the Jean-Jacques Lebel, the French surrealist scene, the Germans, the Swiss. It was really an incredible
right
crowd.
Up through his very last event, which was in 1983, a year before he died, before Ben died, quite painfully, I might add, of cancer of the
liver, prostate,
the biblasa, it's called. But he died in 1984. But his last really big event was a William Burroughs tribute evening, which included myself, Johannes van Dam, Ira Cohen, Bill Levy, the German contingent of Jürgen Ploeg and Udo Brega, and had also a telephone conversation with William Burroughs, who was in Lawrence, Kansas, minding his cats, and he was there with his manager, James Grauerholz, and we had a talk. Udo and I phoned him up, and it was broadcast to the entire audience. So, I mean, this was... this is this type of thing that went on over the years with Ben. He did something very special here.
Well, so this is how the international scene touched Amsterdam, and you're still here. What are you actually doing here right now?
What am I doing? I'd actually like to talk a little bit more about Ben, but
okay.
I'm working on my archives that I'm writing.
That's...
I mean, if one thing that must also be said is that there were very few people who were involved, certainly professionally, with Ben, who did not eventually have certain conflicts. I mean, my relationship with Ben was tumultuous, to say the very least. And
I think anybody's relationship, almost anybody's.
We continued to, see each other through thick and thin, through all different. I went into a long period of near hibernation, and Ben was still one of the few people who I was constantly seeing. But there was a period early on. It lasted for 2 years when we didn't speak, which is to say Ben wouldn't talk to me, because after P78, and as P79 was, coming around, I had certain views about what was happening in that scene, and I thought it was, I won't go into all the details, but that perhaps Ben was making a few mistakes, and I was trying to talk to him about it, and he didn't want to talk about it. So I ended up publishing. I wrote a newsletter called the Other World Poetry Newsletter, and put it in the tabloid format, and I published it. And Ben didn't speak to me for 2 years.
Only? Well,
until Brian Geisen tricked us into talking again.
Yeah.
But it was, and then there were all sorts of people taking sides on it. There was one poet who took a great umbrage at what I wrote and came close to punching me out at P79. And then later came to me, I don't need to mention who, and said, I always knew you were right. Let's go get Ben. And I said, I don't want to get anybody. I said what I had to say, and now I'm just watching it. Yeah. So, I mean, and there were other conflicts, but in the end, it all came out right. And indeed, I was one of the people who read a eulogy for Ben at his funeral. You read something. I wrote a poem. And should I read that? To round it off, not to round when we can say more, but just it says something about who he was. So, whenever Ben, whose English got better over the years, but in the beginning, whenever he didn't completely understand something, but wanted to kind of show his agreement with what he thought was happening, he would just say so for Soyo Ben. From today, for me, the sun rises in the west, where you made poetry happen, when most urgently awaited, and sets in the east, place that gave birth to your visions of tribal gatherings, of poets as messengers, and where I hear you wanted half your ashes scattered. The words, how you been, I shan't hear again without thinking of you. But thank God our differences were reconciled, even as those who never knew better continued to wish that we were still quarreling. In the end, it all came right, was always coming right, in fact. We wheeled and dealed, we talked and didn't talk. We tried at times to take each other for a certain kind of ride. But the real stakes were much bigger, and you for sure drove more than a few of them nicely home. I wore white at your wedding, wear black at your funeral. Yet whether in black, white, or shades and colors somewhere in between, I hope and pray that very soon you will once more be the guy opening the back door to poets in whatever worlds you next encounter. So long, Soyo, scarred samurai of poetry's politics. So, just like that.
Boom Shankar Baba. Okay. I think that's about all for now. It would be very nice to have a little bit more of you on this program that Kleurnet is broadcasting during the whole week. And, of course, we'll probably see you back in some of the videos that we are going to show from the archives.
Yes, indeed. There is a substantial Ben Bissett archive, and there are many tapes from many of the different performances. I know from the William Burroughs tribute evening, also from at least one of the Allen Ginsberg events, and others. Yeah.
So one last thing, I see that you called your small publication "Other World Poetry," and then many years later.
Someone else did.
Someone else came up with that name, and it's very ironic that this guy somehow was helped into starting poetry events a little bit, more or less by me, in Amsterdam.
Right.
He stole the name, Other World Poetry. He opened a bookshop, Other World Books.
The organization is still called Other World Productions. I won't go so far as to say stole. Well, I mentioned it to him once, and I said, "Isn't it ironic? Are you aware of the fact that I put on the first two Other World Poetry events at the Melkweg when I was in a bit of a conflict with Ben, when Ben had taken 2 nights from another poet, and then I went there and put these 2 nights on, and then I, as a consequence, decided to call this newsletter Other World Poetry Newsletter, and was quite astonished some years later when I saw that the Other World Poetry name was being used. But I mean, fine. It was,
Well, anyway, we don't have to go deeper into that, but it's good to see the roots of all evil that are now have now kind of deteriorated into this huge commercial so-called poetry festival. What was it called again? Crossing.
Yes, I mean I have no complaints.
Fingers,
Everybody does things in their own way. And certainly, I mean, the Crossing Border Festival is fulfilling a certain kind of a role, so I'm not going to in any way attack it. I suppose it is. It may not be my scene.
No.
It may not be Ben Passet's scene if Ben was still
It's
around.
not my scene either.
But
is there poetry there?
Oh, I believe there are some poets.
There are some poets there.
Yes, I don't think we should turn it into this.
No. Okay. We can always cut it out.
I mean,
we can cut it out.
There are some other stories that I could tell.
I know.
I don't know.
I know. Yeah, I know. Anyway. Okay, Ben, I hope you're happy with us. Bye-bye.
Ja, en dan laten we wat van dat historische materiaal zien waar Eddie Woods en Hans Plomp het over hadden. Dit is een stukje van One World Poetry uit 1993. De laatste. En dat was een tribute to William Burroughs. In het kader van One World Poetry Revisited. En we gaan in de week van 12 tot 19 november veel meer laten zien. Hoort u Johannes van Dam links en Eddie Woods met werk van en ter ere van William Burroughs.
Bypass skin, colored brown tan-like on his arms and breast, which sat wrinkled on his frame. Thin body, the back of him was stooped, soft, muscled, but vigorous at 78 years. He said, "I always thought poets were lazy prose writers, writing paragraphs and sentences and breaking it up into lines." Climax of long ceremony. On his knees, Mel chanted several long prayers. Then he repeated an anaphoric word in his native Navajo tongue and waved the smoke at all of us separately and prayed repeatedly to the bear spirit, the four-legged people, the two-legged people, the crawling people, the insects, the families, the brothers and sisters here and everywhere, the relatives and their own brothers and sisters or relatives. Family, all one family, no matter what race we come from, all relatives together in a room. Finally, ceremony over, we all ate big servings of pot roast meat, baked cheese potato slices, salad, coffee, a homemade sweet icing cake. Now, next morning, Bill's up talking to his cats, feeding them. I'll get up and see him on his way to Kansas City, 7:30 a.m. Later, read him this account. What now follows is a breakfast talk, table talk between Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs at the table. How did you feel emotionally or psychologically during the exorcism ceremony? That was quite moving. I thought, all those people really wishing you well.
Oh, that's what I felt too. They were really great, and I just felt, sort of laying myself open just completely. Undirected thought. I did nothing, no sort of intellectualizing.
What occurred to me is that we were focusing on your well-being, but also I was realizing at the time, I don't know if you realize how many people really love your work and feel a great deal of affection. There must be hundreds of thousands or millions of people.
Yes, well, yeah, I feel it. I feel it very deeply. I like the shaman very much, the way he was crying.
Later in conversation with the shaman, you were agreeing that in order to get the spirit, you have to see it.
Oh yes, if you see it, if you gain control of it, it's just a matter of, if you see it outside, it's no longer inside.
In other words, unless error were allowed enough play so that it manifested itself visibly,
you would never see it. In exorcism, a verbal argument can never do anything. You can't ever beat the entity in a verbal argument, because that's what he wants. It's only through a confront, a non-verbal confront, that anything happens. It has to be non-verbal, otherwise they'd argue and argue, going around and around and around for 100,000 years. But the arguing has nothing whatever to do with what they're really doing.
So now would you confront the Satan in the Ayatollah and his followers about this price on Salman Rushdie's head and the killing of this Japanese translator?
That is not a question. You think in political terms or justifications, you never get anywhere.
Well, the method of confrontation is now that many of the publishers got together to put out satanic verses in paperback. That's not an argument, that's a deed.
Yes, it might be something, but never a verbal argument. It will never go anywhere except in circles, because you're not talking about the issue at all. You're talking about words.
I like the idea of the idea as a virus. In marketing research, that's exactly what they do. Like for political purposes, make a little 3-word virus slogan.
Why, sure. Now, I know you've heard about the computer viruses.
Yeah, now what they do? Spread through telephone modems?
It can get in the program, and then it's hard to get rid of. They have to kind of call in the priest to exorcise the computer.
What do you think of the shaman Melvin was seeing in you? What do you think he was getting?
He described it as a spirit with like a white skull face, but had no eyes and sort of wings like that.
And did you get any glimpse of such a thing?
Well, I have, many times.
Yeah, and you've painted it in a way.
Yes, I brought it out in some paintings and he would say...
Tot zover een nagespeelde conversatie tussen Burroughs en Ginsberg door Eddie Woods en Johannes van Dam. Alles in het kader van de Poëzieweek. Straks Thea Schierbeek. Maar nu eerst commercials en Hans Plomp